Hi everyone, I'm Emily, 32. In this video I want to share a story from my life about mistakes, weakness, and the painful consequences they bring. I used to have a happy family and a wonderful husband, but because of a moment of weakness I took a wrong step and it ruined everything. The story started when I met my ex-lover. Although I was married, I couldn't resist my feelings when I saw him again. He reconnected with me and I forgot everything I had. Hi everyone, I'm Emily, 32. In this video I'm going to tell a story about mistakes, weakness, and the painful consequences of those mistakes. I used to have a happy family and a wonderful husband, but I made a mistake because I was weak and it ruined everything. The story started when I met my ex-lover. Although I was married, I couldn't resist my feelings when I saw him again. He contacted me again and I forgot everything. But when my husband found out, everything fell apart in an instant. I lost my family and my ex-lover. I'm not going to ask for forgiveness, but I do want to tell those who face similar temptations to be vigilant and to think carefully. Don't let a moment of weakness destroy your whole life. If you get lost, I hope you come back before it's too late. Now please join me in my own story. The story begins when I met Ben, my ex-lover. After many I will tell you my story so you can see what can happen if you're not careful. I met Ben after years of not speaking to each other. We used to love each other so much that nothing could stop the feeling. At college we'd walk by the lake and talk about our dreams and the future. We'd kiss under the streetlights and make promises that I thought would last forever. But then everything changed. We weren't the innocent people we started out as. Life, disagreements, and endless arguments drove us apart. In the end we broke up. We were head over heels in love, but then everything changed. We used to sit by the lake at college and talk about our dreams, but then we fell out of love. I thought our promises would last forever, but then everything changed. We were no longer the two innocent people we used to be. Life, disagreements, and endless arguments drove us apart. In the end we broke up. After I broke up with Ben, I met Mark. He was very different from Ben, mature, stable, and calm. He took care of me, loved me in the way I thought I needed to be loved, and I chose Mark. I chose a stable, peaceful life. We got married and started a small family with Chloe, our 4-year-old daughter. Ben gradually became a thing of the past, a vague memory that I still thought about occasionally, but had peacefully left behind in the old years. But I always felt that Ben was that unforgettable memory. Every time I thought of him, I had this vague, indescribable feeling. We couldn't keep that love, but I still can't deny that Ben was once an important part of my life, and it's not easy to erase that. I guess he's still there somewhere in my thoughts like WH. And I sit quietly at night and wonder if I regret what happened. One day I was sitting by the window in my office and my phone rang. Suddenly it was a message from Ben. He said he'd come back to London after years abroad and wanted to see me. My first emotion was confusion. My heart suddenly stirred, as if a part of the past I thought was asleep had awoken. I hesitated for a long time, not knowing whether to meet him or not. The feeling of wanting to be reunited and the fear of what would happen made me think a lot, but in the end curiosity won out. I received a message from Ben. He said he was coming back to London after years abroad and he wanted to see me. I was a bit confused and my heart fluttered, as if a part of the past I thought was asleep had awoken. I hesitated for ages, not knowing whether to meet him or not. I thought about it a lot, but in the end I agreed to meet him because I wanted to see the person who was an important part of my life again. I didn't know what I was looking for when I decided to meet him, but I knew one thing for sure. This meeting would never be the same. The day I met Ben again I felt like everything had changed, but nothing had changed at all. He wasn't the young man with the innocent smile I knew, but that look, that smile still had a strange attraction, still made my heart beat faster. When I saw him again I realized that things had changed, but not at all. He was no longer the young man with the innocent smile I knew, but that look still had a strange attraction. He was still tall, still had that confident look I used to love, although there had been some changes over time. He seemed more mature, more stable, but to me he was still the man I loved. Even though it had been a long time, we were sitting opposite each other in the familiar cafe where we used to meet when we were students. At that moment, the atmosphere between us seemed to be filled with questions, things that had not been said. Started. He was a bit quicker and he was still tall and confident, but there had been changes. He seemed more mature and stable, but to me he was still the man I loved. We sat opposite each other in the cafe we used to go to when we were students. The atmosphere between us then was full of unspoken questions and things we hadn't said. He began by asking me about my life, my work, and my family. I answered him, feeling like I was trying to keep everything on a safe level, not wanting to let my emotions overwhelm my reason. But gradually we fell into old stories and memories we had shared. Long journeys, winter evenings cuddled together, hasty kisses before parting. These stories were like a river flowing through time, taking us back to those days. Then suddenly I realized that in every one of those stories there was still something. I answered him with a few light-hearted questions about my life, my work, and my family, feeling like I was trying to keep things on a safe level. I didn't want to let my emotions get the better of me. But as time went on, we began to share old stories and memories of the past. These stories took us back to those days. Then suddenly I realized that I was still feeling emotions that I couldn't deny. It felt like it was all coming back to me, like I was caught between decisions I'd never made, with a part of the past I couldn't shake. The meetings became more regular after that. At first I thought they were just two old friends catching up, but gradually I realized things weren't that simple. Every time Ben smiled, every time his eyes met mine, I felt a strange, indescribable sensation. It was a feeling I hadn't felt in years. I couldn't deny it. It felt like everything was coming back. It was as if I was standing between choices I'd never made, with a part of the past I couldn't shake. The meetings became more regular after that. At first I thought they were just two old friends catching up, but gradually I realized things weren't that simple. Every time Ben smiled, every time his eyes met mine, I felt something indescribable. It was a feeling I hadn't felt for years. It was like reliving long-forgotten emotions. He was still the same, with a warm smile and confident eyes. Every time he looked at me, I felt an irresistible pull. It was as if everything around me faded away, leaving just him and me. Our stories became closer, our conversations longer. They weren't just casual greetings but deep conversations about life, memories, what had been lost. As he recounted old memories, I realized that in every word and gesture, Ben still retained everything I loved. He was the same as always, with a warm smile and confident eyes. Every time he looked at me, I felt an irresistible attraction that made everything else fade away. Our conversations lasted longer and we shared our stories. He recounted old memories and I realized that he still had everything I loved about him. Sincerity, warmth, and an intense desire for me. Something inside me seemed to be awakened and I felt a part of the emotion I thought had been dormant for so long. But I knew it was wrong, that I was betraying what I had. I couldn't stop. Every time I saw him, I found myself drawn more and more into this intoxicating feeling. I realized I was looking for something in Ben that I no longer saw in Mark. Mark was a great guy, he loved me, cared for me, was a caring husband and father, but it felt like I was missing a piece of myself. He gave me stability and security, but Ben gave me something else. Excitement, freedom, and a passion I had forgotten. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't help reaching out to him whenever I had the chance, like I was trying to find a part of myself that had been forgotten. No matter how hard I tried to forget, those feelings came back stronger every time I thought about the time I spent with Ben. One night, after Mark had gone to bed, I couldn't resist. I knew it was wrong, but I gave in. We made an appointment for a peely evening, just a few drinks and a chat. But as I sat with him, everything seemed to go back to the way it used to be. Stories about life, about changes over the years, about old memories that made me forget time. Every word Ben said seemed to take me back to the past, to a world where there was only him and me, where Mark was not present, where I was not a wife or a mother, but only Emily, the girl I once loved passionately. It felt so strange, as if I were reliving the sweet days of my youth. Stories of the old days passed as if there had never been a separation, as if we had never been apart, and over the years I'd forgotten time. Every word Ben said took me back to the past, to a world where it was just him and me, where Mark wasn't there, where I wasn't a wife or a mother, but just Emily, the girl I used to love so much. It felt so strange, like I was reliving the good old days. Stories from the past came back as if we'd never been apart. Then for some reason I kissed him, a quick kiss full of desire and old emotions. All reason and inhibitions disappeared in that moment. For the first time in my life I had betrayed Mark, the man I'd promised to spend the rest of my life with. Immediately I felt guilty. I felt like a traitor, like everything I'd built with Mark suddenly didn't matter. Images of him and my daughter Chloe suddenly appeared in my mind. I blamed myself. I felt like I'd lost everything because of a moment of weakness, but then I felt like I'd found a part of myself again, an emotion I hadn't felt for a long time. The freedom, the intensity, the feeling of living with myself that I thought I'd lost for a long time. I couldn't shake the guilt, but I also couldn't deny that it had brought me something indescribable. At that moment, all I could feel was that I felt like I'd lost everything because of a moment of weakness, but then I felt like I'd found a part of myself again. I hadn't felt so free and so intensely in touch with myself in a long time. I couldn't shake the guilt, but I couldn't deny that I was feeling something I couldn't describe. At that moment, I could only feel that I was between two worlds, unable to go back and unable to go forward. The next morning, I couldn't look Mark in the eye. It felt like there was an invisible wall between us, preventing me from facing him. He came home late as he always did and walked through the door looking tired. But today there was something different in the way he looked at me. Unlike the loving, caring eyes I'd seen before, his were cold and silent, as if he was searching for something but didn't know how to say it. I didn't dare speak, didn't dare ask him anything. The atmosphere was unusually heavy. Mark put down his bag and went into the kitchen, making some strange movements as if to hide his tension. I just sat there with my head down, not daring to look at him because I knew in my heart that he had realized something. We didn't say anything, but the silence was heavier than any words that could be spoken. I felt guilty as if there was a shadow hanging over me. I didn't say anything, I didn't ask him anything. The atmosphere in the room was really heavy. Mark put his bag down and went into the kitchen, moving around as if he was hiding something. I just sat there with my head down, not looking at him because I knew he'd figured something out. We didn't say anything, but the silence was worse than any words. I felt guilty, like there was a shadow over my head, making it hard to breathe. Last night I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd done, and every little move I made was haunted by it. I couldn't face Mark, I didn't want to look him in the eye for fear he would think I'd let him down. I had betrayed him, and I knew that no matter how many reasons or explanations I had, I couldn't get back what I had lost in that quiet room. I didn't know what to do, but I kept quiet. I thought that if I didn't say anything, there would be nothing to face or admit. But deep down I knew that everything had changed. Our relationship was never the same again. No matter how hard I tried to hide it, I still couldn't erase that change. A few days later, sitting in the living room, the atmosphere between Mark and I was still heavy. Everything felt thick and foggy. Every word, every gesture felt heavy, as if we were standing on I didn't know what to do, so I just sat there. I knew that everything had changed, although I tried to hide it. A few days later I was sitting in the living room and the atmosphere between Mark and I was still heavy. Everything felt heavy, like we were on the brink of a change that I couldn't back away from. Then Mark came into the room. His eyes were as cold as ever. He didn't say anything, he just took my phone from the table. I felt frozen. I couldn't react, I just watched his fingers slide across the screen. He wasn't in a hurry or angry. Every time he stopped, his eyes swept over me, but he didn't ask any questions. I felt that his silence was a heavier accusation than any words we could say. I was on the verge of a change I couldn't turn back from when Mark suddenly walked into the room. He had the same cold eyes as always and didn't say anything. He just took my phone from the table. I felt like I was instantly frozen. I couldn't react. I just watched his fingers slide across the screen. He wasn't in a hurry or angry. Every time he stopped, his eyes swept over me, but he didn't ask any questions. I felt that his silence was a heavier accusation than any words we had spoken. We looked at each other, but no one spoke. No one dared to speak. I knew he was scrolling through the messages between me and Ben. He was reading the conversations I had tried to keep secret. Sweet words, promises, emotional back and forth that I thought I could only keep in my heart. Each message felt like a betrayal, a deep wound in my heart. When I looked into his eyes, I realized he knew everything. He knew everything without question or explanation. I knew everything was laid bare. We both looked at each other, but neither of us said anything. I knew for sure that he was looking through the messages between me and Ben, the conversations I had tried to keep secret. It was as if he was reading my heart. Every message was like a betrayal, a deep wound in my heart. When I looked into his eyes, I realized he knew everything. I felt guilty and like I was standing in front of a mirror looking at myself. I didn't recognize the person I had hurt, the person I loved. Everything suddenly shattered, like a picture being torn to pieces. The whole living room became small and suffocating. I wanted to say I was sorry, but I couldn't find the words. I knew that no matter what I said, things could never be the same again. Mark didn't shout, he didn't make a fuss, but his silence made me feel as if everything had been taken away from me. He wasn't angry, there was no hysteria or destruction as I'd imagined. He just stood there, silent, and everything around him suddenly became terribly quiet. He took my phone and scrolled through the messages, but I felt every heavy moment as if every time he read another line, the distance between us grew. When he finally looked up, he looked at me with eyes that weren't angry but cold. His silence made me feel as if everything had been taken away from me. He wasn't angry, there was no hysteria or destruction as I had imagined. He just stood there, silent, and everything around him went terribly quiet. He took my phone and scrolled through the messages, but I felt every heavy moment as if the distance between us grew every time he read another message. When he finally looked up, his eyes weren't angry, they were cold. I felt my heart break. He said just one sentence, his voice deep but full of pain. "Emily, you have betrayed me. You are no longer someone I can trust." Those words were like knives in my heart, not because he shouted or made a fuss, but because I could feel the pain in every word he said. He didn't need to cry or shout, but his gaze, like a sharp knife, cut into the peace we had built. He looked at me not with the eyes of a loving husband, but of a man who was losing the most precious thing in his life. He looked at me with disappointment, as if I were a completely different person, someone he no longer recognized, and I stood there not knowing what to do. The apology couldn't escape my throat because I knew what I had done was unforgivable. I had betrayed him not just once but gradually, little by little, until I couldn't go back. He looked at me as if I were a stranger, as if I'd become someone else. I stood there not knowing what to do. I knew I'd done something unforgivable and I felt I'd betrayed him. I'd done it to him again and again and I couldn't go back. We were both silent and it felt like the space around us was getting smaller and smaller. His silence felt heavy and painful and no words could break it. I sat there, my heart feeling empty and heavy. Every word felt meaningless. All that remained was the terrible silence between us, as if the whole world had collapsed and nothing could be done to save it. When I came home from work the next day, the atmosphere in the house was the same. We were all silent, not saying a word. We were all lost in our own thoughts and I could feel the space around us shrinking. This silence felt heavy and painful and it went on and no words could break it. I sat there, my heart empty and heavy. Every word felt meaningless. All that remained was the terrible silence between us, as if the whole world had collapsed and nothing could be done to save it. When I came home from work the next day, the atmosphere in the house was the same as usual, but strangely quiet. Everything seemed frozen. Time seemed to have stood still. Mark was no longer there. The house was silent. There was no sound of him talking or his footsteps passing by. I walked into the room and the room was the same, but a cold sensation hit me immediately. He was gone. I found the divorce papers on the table without a signature, but I knew it was his decision. He hadn't said anything, hadn't left a note, just silence. The words on the papers were all a bit strange. It was as if everything had just stopped. Nothing felt right, nothing felt wrong, it was all just strange. I walked into the room and it felt like Mark wasn't there anymore. Everything was the same, but it felt cold. I found the divorce papers on the table. They weren't signed, but I knew it was his decision. He hadn't said anything, hadn't left a note, just silence. The words on the white paper were like the clearest confirmation that everything was over. I felt empty, as if I had been left in the middle of a storm of my own making. Every reason, every explanation no longer had any meaning. All I could do was stare at the paper and feel my heart tighten with each beat. When I looked for him, he was gone. He wasn't home. There were no angry words, no curses. There was no argument, no hateful words echoing in the air, just a terrible silence like a deep. The white paper was the last straw. I felt empty, as if I had been left in the middle of a storm of my own making. Every reason, every explanation no longer had any meaning. All I could do was stare at the paper and feel my heart tighten with each beat. When I looked for him, he was gone. He wasn't home. There were no angry words or curses. There was no argument. No hateful words echoing in the air. Just a terrible silence like a deep cut in my heart. He didn't have to say anything more. His silence was like a final statement. He couldn't live with me anymore. I tried to think of what I could do to stop him, but deep down I knew I had no right to keep him. I had betrayed his trust, broken everything we had built up over the years. I couldn't ask him for forgiveness. I couldn't call him back because I knew I didn't deserve it. I was left with a feeling of emptiness. He didn't have to say a word, his silence was like a final declaration. He couldn't live with me anymore. I thought about what I could do to stop him, but deep down I knew I had no right to keep him. I'd betrayed his trust, broken everything we'd built up over the years. I couldn't ask for his forgiveness or call him back because I knew I didn't deserve it. I felt empty. Everything suddenly fell apart, not because of a big argument or a tantrum, but because of silence. It was an unspoken end, and all I could do was watch the things I once loved slowly disappear, unable to do anything to stop it. After the divorce, I looked for Ben, but he didn't answer me. I called him, texted him, tried to contact him in every way I knew, but there was no word from him. I could do nothing but stare at my mobile phone, where my messages went silent. Ben didn't want to be with me anymore. I could feel it in every minute of silence, in the distance he deliberately created. I understood why he wasn't the solution to the mistakes I'd made. What I'd done couldn't be fixed by an old relationship or the old feelings I'd thought were important. I'd thought that if I went back to Ben I could find something to fill the void in my heart, but now I knew that was an illusion. I had lost Mark, my wonderful husband. He was the man I loved and cherished, the man I chose to be with. I couldn't go back to the past, I couldn't put things right even if I wanted to. The feeling was unbearable. I wanted to apologize and put things back the way they were, but I knew that betrayal was not easily forgiven. Mark was not the only one. I had lost Mark, my wonderful husband. He was the man I had loved and cherished, the man I had chosen to be my life partner. But I couldn't go back to the past, I couldn't undo what had been done even if I wanted to. I couldn't. The feeling was unbearable. I wanted to apologize to him, to make things go back to the way they were, but I knew that betrayal was not easily forgiven. Mark wasn't the only one who had been hurt. I had been hurt too. Now, sitting in the empty house, I could feel the loneliness enveloping me. Everything around me was silent, leaving only the sound of me and the empty thoughts in my head. Every corner of the room, every object in the house reminded me of the old days, the days when I still had a family, still had people who loved me. But now everything was shattered, like broken glass scattered everywhere, beyond repair. I wondered if I could heal these wounds. I'd been hurt. I'd hurt myself. I sat in the empty house and felt lonely. Everything was silent except for the sound of my thoughts. Every corner of the room, every object in the house reminded me of the old days when I had a family and people who loved me. But now everything was shattered, like broken glass scattered everywhere, beyond repair. I wondered if I could heal these wounds, find peace, trust, and a little love within myself after all that had happened. But then I realized it wouldn't be easy. My wounds were too deep, too big to heal overnight, and I had no one to rely on. I had destroyed everything. Not just my family, but myself, everything I believed in, everything I had collapsed under the betrayal I had caused. And now I was left alone to face the emptiness of my wrong choices. There was no one to blame. I thought I could find peace, trust, and a little love within myself after all that had happened, but then I realized it wasn't that easy. My wounds were too deep, too big to heal overnight, and I had no one to rely on. I had destroyed everything, not just my family but myself. Everything I believed in, everything I had collapsed under the betrayal I had caused, and now I was left alone to face the emptiness of my wrong choices. There was no one to blame but myself, in the silence of the empty house with the broken pieces of my own life. Through this story, I want to advise you never to gamble with trust in a relationship. Sometimes we think that a mistake won't hurt, but the truth is that even the smallest decisions can have consequences we never expected. If you are in a relationship, remember that honesty and respect are essential. One betrayal can destroy everything, and when it all comes crashing down, you'll realize that nothing was worth it. So this story is not just about betrayal, it's also about the importance of maintaining trust and true love. It's a reminder that the price of deception is never worth what you lose. Don't let weakness and fleeting emotions destroy the strong and happy relationships you've built. If you're wrong, don't hide or try to justify it. Face the truth and learn to make things right. You can only move on and rebuild what you've lost by admitting your mistakes and learning to forgive yourself.